Okay, so let's dive in. Imagine this place, right? It's whispered about in these ancient texts. You see it painted on temple walls, a source of, well, incredible wealth and really exotic wonders for ancient Egypt, one of the world's great civilizations.
Yeah, a land known pretty much only through the stuff it traded. Its actual location, lost, just faded away over time, really, becoming more legend than, a pinpoint on a map.
Exactly. This is the land of Punt, hugely important trading partner for Egypt, going back, what, over 3,000 years? And for centuries, maybe longer, where it actually was, has been this massive debate for historians, archaeologists.
And what's really cool here, I think, is that we often picture solving these ancient puzzles by, like, finding a new inscription or digging up a lost city. But in this case, it's modern science stepping up.
Right, like a detective.
Totally. We're looking at, really cutting-edge lab techniques to try and crack this geographical code from millennia ago, connecting the dots between, say, an ancient carving and what a mass spectrometer tells us today.
And this is where it gets really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most sought-after things from Punt, maybe surprisingly, wasn't just the gold or the incense, though, yeah, those were huge, but live animals,
Mm-hmm.
specifically baboons, sacred baboons. Just pause on that for a second. Ancient Egyptians arranging expeditions to import monkeys. So the big question, the mystery we're really digging into is, can looking at the actual physical remains of these ancient baboons, using things like ancient DNA, isotopic analysis, can that finally help us figure out, with some scientific backing, where this lost land of Punt actually was?
And then, this particular deep dive we're doing today, it's actually drawn from a really fascinating article we got our hands on. It was published in the National Public Diplomacy Group's quarterly online magazine,
Ah, yes, that publication.
specifically their March publication.
Mm.
And it gives this brilliant overview of how all these different fields, history, archaeology, hard science, are coming together to tackle these old historical puzzles.
So our mission, really, guided by this article, is to unpack what it found.
Yeah.
We want to follow that trail from the hieroglyphs and the amazing temple pictures that first mentioned Punt, all the way to these sophisticated lab results that are starting to give us real solid clues about where it might have been.
It's a journey from ancient art to modern biogeochemistry, essentially.
And the star of the scientific detective story, as you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
the animal whose remains are the key, the Hamadryas Baboon.
Mm-hmm.
The article really puts this creature front and center.
Right. The source describes it. It's the largest monkey species found in Eritrea, over in the Horn of Africa. Adult males can weigh up to, 17 kilos? So they're pretty substantial animals.
Yeah.
Distinctive.
And not exactly rare in that area today, are they? The article gives a really vivid sense of that.
No, not at all. It makes a point of saying how common. For example, people driving on the highway between Asmara, the capital, and Massawa, the port city, they apparently often see big groups, sometimes 50 or more baboons, not just like way off in the distance, but right there beside the road or even crossing it. It really grounds the animal in that modern place, Eritrea, and shows how common they are there now.
And this animal just wandering across the highway in modern Eritrea is the tangible link back thousands of years. The source points out this potential connection, suggesting Eritrean baboons might be the ancestors, the origin of the ones found mummified in Egyptian tombs, remains that are over 3,000 years old.
It's a direct line, yeah. A physical thread connecting a modern spot on the map, Eritrea, with this ancient mystery, all via this one type of monkey. The article even mentions, sort of as a side note, that their next issue will look at the ecology of living baboons there, which sounds interesting biologically, but for us, for this historical deep dive.
Right, for us, it's their ancient role as basically cargo that matters.
Precisely. And why did the Egyptians want these specific animals so badly? Well, it wasn't just because they looked exotic. These Hamadryas baboons had a really special, even sacred role in ancient Egypt. They're often just called the sacred baboon.
Yeah, and the article gets into the why, which is crucial context.
Yeah.
They weren't just, pets. They were tied into some major deities.
Exactly. They were seen as a representative, maybe even a manifestation of Thoth.
The god of wisdom, scribes.
Moon knowledge. Thoth was a huge deal in the Egyptian pantheon. Very important god.
And it went beyond just representing Thoth, right? They actually had a role in the sun god's journey.
That's right. You see these depictions, especially relating to Ra, the sun god, traveling across the sky.
Yeah.
Baboons are shown welcoming the sunrise, making noise, chattering. Sometimes they're even shown as advisors to Ra on his solar boat. And this probably came from actually watching baboons in the wild. They do get noisy around dawn. So getting a live sacred baboon wasn't just collecting an exotic animal. It was like having a piece of the divine, a connection to their core beliefs about the cosmos. That high status explains why they'd go to such lengths to get them.
And here's the absolute clincher. The reason this whole trade thing even happened, as the article points out very clearly, there were just no native baboons in Egypt itself.
The Nile Valley environment, it just wasn't their habitat.
So, unlike maybe some other animals, if they wanted these sacred baboons for temples or for the pharaoh's court, or eventually mummifying them for burials.
They had to import them. No other way. They had to come from somewhere else.
And their own records, the ancient Egyptian texts, they tell us where these prized animals and other stuff came from. This place called Punt, somewhere in Africa, south of Egypt.
Yep. And these records go back an incredibly long way. We're talking the 18th dynasty, which is what, roughly 1550 to 1295 BC, over 3,000 years ago?
The New Kingdom's height, really.
Pretty much. Massive wealth expansion, lots of trade for prestige goods. And the records talk about these big expeditions, often by sea, bringing back all sorts of amazing stuff to the capital, Thebes, modern Luxor.
And the stuff they brought back, the article lists it.
Ah.
Gold, obviously,
Yep.
aromatic resins like frankincense and myrrh, huge for rituals and perfumes.
Valuable skins, exotic woods.
And, crucially for our story, live baboons. Among other exotic animals. These weren't everyday goods, they were luxury items. High value, fueling the whole Egyptian system, religious and economic.
And this is the absolute core of the historical puzzle, why it's taken so long, while the hieroglyphs give us amazing detail on the trade, what they got, maybe even bits about the journey.
They're totally silent on where exactly Punt was.
Frustratingly silent. They describe going to Punt, they list what came from Punt, but there's no map, no clear geographical reference that lets us say, okay, Punt was here. That missing piece is why it's been such a mystery and why science is now stepping in.
But the Egyptians did leave more than just words. They left pictures. Amazing detailed pictures on temple and tomb walls. The article mentions specific ones you can still see in Thebes.
Oh, absolutely. If you go to Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, that's 18th dynasty, right in the peak Punt trade era, the walls show these incredible scenes from her expedition to Punt. The source really highlights these.
And what do they actually show?
All sorts of things. Egyptian ships arriving, interacting with Punt's inhabitants, loading goods. You even see them carrying whole incense trees, root balls and all, onto the ships. And super important for us, as the article points out, you see the animals being brought back. Images of 2 baboons on one wall, clear as day, part of the hall.
And there's an even more direct visual link connecting the baboons to Punt itself.
Yes. The article specifically mentions pictures of baboons depicted on the sail of an Egyptian ship that's explicitly shown returning from Punt.
Wow, actually on the sail.
Yeah, like cargo, clearly marked as coming back from Punt. It's stunning visual proof of the trade and how important the baboons were. And you can still see these carvings today, knowing they're over 3,000 years old. It's quite something.
And it wasn't just Hatshepsut. The article mentions another really famous example, right?
Right, the image of 12 sacred baboons painted on a wall inside King Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Another 18th dynasty pharaoh, a bit later than Hatshepsut. Seeing them pop up in these different high-status contexts, a major temple, a king's tomb, it just underlines how central these baboons and the trade with Punt that supplied them were to the Egyptians.
So, okay, we have this period of really active trade, documented in writing, shown in art. But as the article explains, this direct pipeline between Egypt and Punt didn't just go on forever.
That's right. It seems like that really intensive commerce started to tail off after the reign of Ramesses III. He was the 20th dynasty pharaoh, so we're talking maybe 1186 to 1155 BC, roughly. A definite shift away from that 18th dynasty peak.
And the results of that decline, plus the fact they never wrote down exactly where Punt was
that the memory just sort of faded. Punt went from being a known, if distant, trading partner to something more like a half-remembered legend, a sort of mythical land in later Egyptian history. The actual place was effectively lost to memory.
But the region where many people think Punt might have been, that didn't just drop off the map commercially forever, did it? The article brings in another important historical site.
No, exactly. It introduces Adulis.
Adulis.
Right. The source tells us that much, much later, we're talking 1st century BC, so maybe 1,000 years after Punt's heyday, this other major trading center emerges in that same general part of the world, the port city of Adulis.
And we know where Adulis was.
Oh yeah, its location is pretty well established. It was on the coast near the Gulf of Zila in what's now Eritrea. And when Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, Adulis really boomed. It became the main connection point between Roman Egypt, the Mediterranean, and the Horn of Africa, particularly the powerful Aksumite kingdom inland. Adulis was a huge deal for nearly 1,000 years itself, only really declining around the 9th century AD.
Okay, so you've got Punt, ancient trade source, location unknown, and then centuries later, Adulis known trade hub in roughly the right area. This connection, or potential connection, has fueled a big debate, hasn't it?
Absolutely. For ages, historians and archaeologists, looking at the geography and the kinds of goods traded, because similar things were available in the Horn of Africa later on too, have floated this idea. Maybe Adulis and Punt were essentially the same place, or at least in the same coastal zone. Specifically, maybe on the Eritrean coast south of Massawa.
But the massive elephant in the room is that 1,000-year gap.
That's the huge hurdle, yeah. It makes a direct, continuous link really hard to prove definitively.
And the core reason it's stayed a debate, as the source says, is just that lack of ancient Egyptian confirmation. No text says Punt is here.
Exactly. Despite all the descriptions of goods, the pictures, nothing nails down the location. It's always been about inference, interpretation, educated guesswork based on, well, circumstantial evidence.
Although the article does mention one little piece of physical evidence found at Adulis that offers a bit of a hint, maybe bridging that gap.
Yes, that was an interesting point in the source. It mentions archaeologists finding 2 tiny fragments of glass vessels. These were found way down in the lowest, earliest layers when they excavated Adulis layers, dating right back to the start of the port.
And why are these little bits of glass significant?
Their significance, according to the article, is that when they were analyzed, they turned out to be similar either in chemical makeup or style to glass samples we know are from 18th dynasty Egypt.
The exact period of the big Punt expeditions.
Precisely. So finding glass that looks like it came from Egypt during the peak Punt trade era, physically located at the site of Adulis, well, it's a tangible thread.
Doesn't prove Adulis was Punt, but...
But it suggests some kind of contact or activity was happening in that location, maybe even way back during the Punt period. It makes that hypothesis of a connection, even across the 1,000 years, feel a bit more grounded in something physical.
And this is where the modern science really kicks in, picking up where the texts and the archaeology kind of hit a wall. This is the really exciting stuff covered in that article from the National Public Diplomacy Group's quarterly online magazine, the March publication. It talks about these recent scientific studies using the actual traded goods, the baboon mummies, to try and find answers.
Yes, the article focuses on results from 2 separate recent scientific papers. They analyze sacred baboon mummies that had been dug up from ancient Egyptian tombs. These mummies, these actual physical remains of the animals traded thousands of years ago, they're the key. They're like little biological time capsules carrying chemical and genetic clues about where they originally came from.
Okay, let's break down that first study the article covers, the one from 2020 using isotopic analysis.
Okay, so isotopic analysis. It's a pretty neat biogeochemical tool. This 2020 study looked specifically at the ratios of different stable isotopes, basically, different versions of oxygen and strontium. These get locked into tooth enamel as teeth are forming.
Right.
And the cool thing is, the ratios of these isotopes, like oxygen 18 versus oxygen 16 or different types of strontium, they vary from place to place. It depends on things like the local water sources, the underlying rocks, the geology of the area, even the altitude.
So as an animal is growing up, eating, and drinking, its teeth basically record the isotopic signature of that specific location, like a chemical fingerprint of where it grew up.
Exactly. And tooth enamel is great because once it's formed, it's really stable, it doesn't change much, it locks in that environmental fingerprint. So what the researchers did in 2020 was build this huge comparison app. They took samples from 155 modern baboons from 77 different places across Africa.
Wow, 77 locations.
Yeah, a massive effort to map out what the expected isotopic fingerprints look like for baboons from different parts of the continent today.
And the ancient sample, the mummy they analyzed.
The source says this particular mummy was one that had been acquired way back in 1837, bought in Egypt, given to the British Museum, and its provenance, where it was found in Egypt, was recorded as the Temple of Khonsu in Thebes, Luxor.
Okay.
And that temple was built during the 20th dynasty between about 1186 and 1155 BC. So the mummy's context fits right in or just after that period when the Punt trade was declining from its peak. The animal itself likely lived and was traded during or just after that key era.
Okay, so they have the ancient mummy from Thebes. They have this detailed map of modern baboon isotope signatures across Africa. They compare the mummy's tooth enamel isotopes to the modern map. What did they find? What did the article report?
The key finding was a match. When they compared the oxygen-strontium ratio from the ancient mummy's tooth to the strontium ratio they'd measured in all those modern baboons.
They found a match. To where?
The isotopic signature from that mummy, the baboon brought from Punt over 3,000 years ago, it most closely matched the strontium isotope ratios found in modern baboon populations from the Horn of Africa. And crucially, the article specifically points out this region includes modern-day Eritrea.
Okay, wow. So what does that isotopic match really tell us about Punt's location? Based on how the article interprets it, does it pinpoint Adulis?
Well, this is where the source is quite careful. It says this finding is powerful evidence, but it doesn't by itself confirm Adulis as the specific place this one mummy came from. Isotopic signals, especially strontium, tend to reflect a broader region with similar geology, not necessarily one tiny spot.
Right, so it's not like putting an X on a treasure map.
Not quite a bullseye on Adulis based just on this one mummy's isotopes. However, what it does do is massively narrow down the possibilities. It shows the region where this baboon came from, and therefore, presumably, at least one source area for Punt's exports is limited to a specific zone within the Horn of Africa. And that zone includes the location of Adulis.
So it takes somewhere south of Egypt and makes it somewhere in this scientifically defined part of the Horn of Africa.
Exactly. It basically rules out a lot of other candidates that people had suggested over the years, like maybe parts of Arabia or much further south in East Africa. It's a huge step using chemistry locked in a 3,000-year-old tooth to put geographic boundaries on a lost land.
That's incredible progress right there. But the article then talks about a second study, even more recent 2023, using a completely different scientific approach, DNA.
Right. The 2023 study switched from chemistry to genetics. They used ancient DNA analysis, looking at the actual genetic code preserved in a mummy's remains. DNA tells you about ancestry, population connections, things that also often correlate with geography.
So how did they use DNA to try and find the location?
In this case, they compared the mitochondrial DNA, that's mtDNA, passed down the maternal line from one baboon mummy found in Egypt to mtDNA they got from 14 museum specimens of modern Hamadryas baboons. And these modern samples were deliberately chosen from those key potential source regions people have argued about: Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan.
So comparing the ancient DNA sequence to modern ones from likely locations.
Exactly. To see which modern group the ancient baboon was most closely related to, genetically speaking.
And the results. What do the DNA show, according to the article?
The results, it says, place the ancient mummy's mtDNA sequence firmly within the genetic cluster of baboons that live today in eastern Sudan and Eritrea.
Eastern Sudan and Eritrea.
That-
Hang on, that's the same general area that the isotope study pointed to.
Exactly. The article presents this as...
This is where it gets really persuasive, isn't it? You've got two totally different scientific methods.
Yeah.
One, looking at chemistry linked to where the animal grew up, its food, water, geology.
Isotope analysis, yeah.
And the other, looking at its genetic ancestry, reflecting population history over time.
DNA analysis.
And both of them, independently, converge on the same relatively small geographic area. Both point towards a region covering parts of modern Eritrea and eastern Sudan.
Yeah, and having two different scientific angles land in the same ballpark like that, it really strengthens the whole argument considerably. It shifts the discussion. It's not just historical guesswork or interpreting vague texts anymore. Now you've got, scientifically supported probability behind that specific region. It makes that old idea Punt was near Adulis seem much, much more likely than it did before these studies. It's a great example of how mixing different kinds of research can lead to breakthroughs on these really old, stubborn questions.
So, okay, maybe these studies aren't the absolute final, definitive, Punt is exactly here, case closed. Answer, we still don't have that ancient signpost with GPS coordinates?
No, not yet.
But it feels like really significant, maybe even game-changing progress has been made, all thanks to analyzing the leftovers of animals traded thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. And the source, the article, it finishes on quite a hopeful note, actually. It suggests that, more research, especially using maybe even more advanced ancient DNA techniques, maybe analyzing more mummies or even remains of other things traded from Punt, that could potentially refine the location even further, maybe get us that final answer someday.
So what does this journey mean for you listening to this?
Well, we've just taken this deep dive, really guided by the work presented in that National Public Diplomacy Group's quarterly online magazine article, the March one, a dive across thousands of years. We started with this enigmatic land, Punt, known mostly from Egyptian trade lists and those amazing temple pictures. We followed one specific fascinating thread, the Hamadryas Baboon, the sacred baboon of Egypt. We saw how that trade faded, how Punt became legend, and how, much later, Adulis rose up in a region many suspected was the right place. And then we saw how modern science isotopes, DNA applied to the actual remains of those traded baboons, has given us these powerful, independent, new lines of evidence.
Evidence pointing strongly, using both environmental and genetic fingerprints towards the same place. A specific area in the Horn of Africa, covering parts of Eritrea and eastern Sudan. That's the likely homeland of those ancient baboons, and therefore the likely region of Punt itself. It gives us a solid, scientifically backed geographical zone for a place that was just myth and debate for so long. It really shows how combining history, art, and cutting-edge science can light up these lost corners of the past.
And it leaves you with something to think about, doesn't it? If we learned this much about Punt's probable location just by studying one kind of traded item, the baboon, imagine what other secrets might be locked away. What could we learn about other lost places or ancient connections by applying similar science to the remains of other traded animals or maybe even plants preserved from the ancient world?
Or just consider the bigger idea. Places that were once thriving centers, known in their day but then lost to time, can maybe be slowly brought back into focus millennia later. Not necessarily by finding their name carved on a stone, but by reading the silent chemical and genetic stories hidden inside the very goods they once sent out into the world. It's an incredible bridge between past and present, built by science. Definitely something to mull over.